So I guess that's a good tribute to CPAC's skills and where the rubber hits the road is when you want someone to turn up for an event, always go for flattery initially, and then that'll hopefully put them in a good mood. So thanks for the introduction, Ken. As Ken mentioned, I've been asked to speak here as a recent graduate of CPAC's and a recent student, and also to reflect on some of the maybe future directions of CPAC's from the sort of perspective of students and aspiring peace researchers and activists such as myself. I actually think CPAC's is really, really well placed to be really successful and to continue to be successful in the new environment that various people have alluded to here, with both within the university and outside in the public discourse. I think that's for a range of reasons, but it draws on the fact that CPAC's is very inclusive as a community, the fact that we focus on principled public work, advocacy work, and the sort of practice work that Patricia and myself have been trying to build through the CPAC's Peace Practice Working Group. Another reason I think is that we take an analytical and critical approach, and that sort of cluster of three reasons I think really culminates for students in making CPAC's, I think, a really engaging and inspiring place to be. I guess I'm a sort of a usual student to CPAC's, and then I came to CPAC's for fairly unusual reasons. I lived in Japan for a few years, 3 years as an assistant English teacher there, and one of the things that really struck me there was the experience of being a minority, which of course a lot of people in this room will have experienced and work with as well. But for me, being a young white guy in his mid-20s, who of course knew everything that was fairly important, about what they wanted to do with their life, growing up in a very privileged middle-class background, it was a real shock and a real emotional education that could have never really had in a typical classroom. Although, of course, that's the sort of experiences we're looking to sort of build into and institutionalise in our courses, to the experience of being a minority, for example, being turned away from going into a pub, turning up to the pub and talking to the owner of the pub, said, "Oh, my friends just came in, where did they go?" And the owner of the pub said, "Sorry, the pub's closed," while I sat around and everyone was still having a drink, and she said, "Oh, sorry, your friends went home," not realising that my friend looked Japanese and he was sitting at the bar having a beer. So those sort of frustrating experiences at the time, there'd be a fight at a bar, which of course I was, completely uninvolved with, dancing up on the dance floor and drinking with my friends. But as soon as I would head outside, the Japanese policeman would turn up, survey the crowd, see that I was the only white guy in the crowd, walk straight up to me and have a nice chat, So those sort of experiences really, I guess, piqued my interest, but in a more important way than sort of studying what I had previously, theory and social psychology and that sort of thing. And I started the search for, okay, how can we practically address this challenge of majority, minority, out-group, in-group sort of relations. Previous to that, I'd started, my first training in peace and conflict studies was in a martial art, which I guess is another sort of example of how people come to CPAC's for lots of unusual reasons. And even though when I got to CPAC's, it seemed to be completely counterintuitive to everyone that, why would you want to do peace studies through a martial art? I noticed it was a very interesting space where people were actually very open and inclusive, and they were really keen to listen. Okay, how would this interesting sort of tension play out? So one of my first experiences was helping to organise a martial arts presentation at a peace conference that CPAC's hosted back in 2010. And Jake's typical sort of directness and practicality, when I voiced concern that there was a very competitive and fairly violent martial art that someone else had proposed to do a presentation on at the conference, Jake said, "Oh, well, I see what you're hearing. If you think you can do something better, then why don't you go ahead and organise it?" I thought, oh, bloody hell, right, okay, I've got to put my actions where my mouth is now, and I've got to try and put something together. So that was sort of one of my first experiences of really doing activism stuff through CPAC's. Even though pretty much everyone that I talked to didn't really have any idea or didn't appear to have much of an idea of how martial arts could relate to peace work, there was still a space and a support and resources provided for that, which is, I think, really about what encourages a lot of our students to come here, is that it's about support and engagement and encouragement and just being open as well, particularly with, the way that some generational factors can work out. Perhaps older generations might be more Eurocentric than younger generations or whatever, but the fact that people are reflexive about that, I think, is very, very important. So I think CPAX is interesting because even though we pride ourselves on being a pretty flat organisation, I don't think we should underwrite ourselves the importance of leadership. I think one really important thing about CPAX is that, which is encouraging for students, is that we lead from the front. You know, whether it's Jake standing with his lovely bright red NTU t-shirt, handing out flyers during the strikes, or whether it's Stuart spending probably about over 30 phone calls calling the what is known as the Festival of Dangerous Ideas to try and convince them that a world-renowned non-violent activist is not too dangerous for the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. I think that when students see that, I think it's very encouraging. And as we all know, and a lot of activism involves a lot of pressure from various different groups towards ourselves. For example, during the Dalai Lama event, when I was running an organisation called the Global Social Justice Network, and we'd been trying to organise an event for the Dalai Lama to come. The student who had really very deep connections and contacts with the Tibetan community, she'd been trying to organise this event through, as Jake mentioned, the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. One day she called me up, this was back a couple of years ago, she called me up in tears actually and said, they've nixed the event, they said there's no way the event's going to go ahead. The university has blocked it, even though the university had previously authorised it and then blocked it. And she was really, really distraught. And I mean, personally, I was too as well. We'd put in a lot of time and effort into this event, hoping that the university could host the Dalai Lama, but because of financial considerations from funding from the Chinese government and that sort of thing, the event was nixed. And some of the sort of strange considerations over the other side of the bridge for the university, I think, were revealed in that one person on the university senate, the governing level for the university, actually remarked that if it was, Chinese government funding for research versus academic freedom, they knew which one they would choose. Well, I'll give you a hint, it's not the academic freedom. So that's the sort of environment that CPAX is working within, even within the university. So I had I sort of slept on it and thought, what can we do to try and get this event working? And then I thought to myself, I proposed to Stuart, a long time before that, that we hosted Dalai Lama, and Stuart remarked that, well, the Dalai Lama comes every 6 months, doesn't have much trouble having events, so, perhaps it's not the best focus for CPAX, and there's so many other events. But the moment that I mentioned to Stuart, I realised, hey, this is the sort of situation that maybe will be very important for Stuart and he can support us. The moment that I mentioned to Stuart that there had been a massive amount of pressure against the event, Stuart was behind us 100%, and that really made a big difference. Really made a big difference. The fact that other departments or a so-called Institute for Democracy and Human Rights had folded, and later on when I talked to people, I won't mention the professor that I talked to, but the professor called me into his office associated with the event, and he said that he'd had a lot of the threats levelled against him as well, physical threats to not have a hold of that event, and myself as well. I had threats for someone threatening to try and have me fired from my job as well. But the fact that Stuart and the CPAX community were there to really support that, I think, was very significant.